They say every sin on a plantation begins in silence. Silence behind closed doors, silence in dim hallways, silence in the breath between two people who should never have stood that close. But the night she invited him into her bedroom, the Tennessee air itself seemed to stop moving, as if even nature refused to witness what was about to happen. And long before the first rumor formed, long before swelling bellies exposed the truth, the plantation had already begun to rot from that single moment of forbidden desire. She was the mistress of the house, refined, polished, raised never to sweat in the fields or lift anything heavier than a teacup. He was a slave, broad-shouldered, quiet, and watched too closely by everyone for reasons no one talked about aloud. People whispered that his silence held power. Others claimed his stare could melt fear into something far more dangerous. But none of those whispers stopped the mistress from calling him to her room that night, with trembling hands and a hunger she'd denied for years. The house was asleep when she did it. The master was away on business, the overseers drunk in their quarters, the slaves exhausted from a day's labor. Only one candle burned in her room, throwing long shadows across her bed. She stood there in a silk nightgown that hid nothing, pretending she had called him to fix the window shutter. But when he stepped inside, tall enough to block the candlelight, something inside her broke loose, something she never knew she was capable of wanting. She touched him first. That was the moment she crossed a line that history itself would never forget. And he didn't resist. Maybe he was afraid. Maybe he was trapped. Maybe he wanted it. No one would ever know, because the only people who truly witnessed that night carried their secrets to the grave. But what happened between them didn't end when she fell asleep against his chest. It didn't end when the candle burned out. It didn't end in the morning when he slipped back into the quarters before anyone noticed. It was only the beginning. The following weeks moved like normal. Cotton weighed, fields plowed, orders shouted. She walked through the house with the same grace, the same authority, the same cold chin lifted above the slaves who bowed their heads as she passed. But inside her chest something pulsed. Fear, guilt, anticipation, maybe even longing. She told herself she could lock the memory away and pretend it never happened. She was wrong. It started subtly. A woman in the quarters fell ill. Morning sickness, they said. Then another woman complained of dizziness. Then 2 more refused to do heavy labor, holding their stomachs protectively. Then the midwife started watching the quarter women with strange eyes, whispering to herself. The mistress didn't notice at first, too focused on hiding her own trembling hands whenever someone mentioned the slave she had taken into her bed. But the whispers grew. Slaves huddled at night, talking in hushed tones. Overseers grumbled about laziness, though deep down they sensed something wasn't right. Even the master, upon returning, remarked that the women looked strangely soft, strangely round. The mistress felt heat rush through her body, not from guilt, but from a terror she couldn't explain. Then came the moment that shattered her composure. She passed 2 of the quarter women in the yard and overheard one whisper to the other, "Us all carrying at the same time? Ain't natural, ain't coincidence." Her chest tightened. That night she couldn't sleep. She paced her room. She watched the window. She pressed her trembling fingers to her temples. Because deep down, something she didn't want to admit, something monstrous, entered her mind. The women weren't sick. They were pregnant. All of them. And when she replayed their faces, their dates, their symptoms, she realized they all conceived around the same time, around the same night she had called him into her room. Her stomach dropped with such force she had to sit down. The candle flickered violently as if reacting to the truth she was finally willing to see. The slave she had slept with hadn't just touched her, he had touched all of them. And now every woman on the plantation, herself included, was carrying a secret that would destroy every wall, every lie, every illusion of control the plantation had ever held. Her forbidden night wasn't just a sin. It was the spark that would burn the entire estate to the ground. They said the plantation lady first noticed him the way a person notices a storm coming in the distance. Silent, slow, and impossible to stop once it arrives. She had lived her entire life in Magnolia Hollow, surrounded by the stiff, polished world of Tennessee aristocracy, where women were expected to keep their voices low and their desires even lower. But the moment she saw him, brought in shackled, dust-covered, and half-starved, something in her life shifted off its axis. No one on the plantation understood what she saw in him, To them, he was just another enslaved man acquired at auction, a body assigned to labor. But to her, he was a disruption, a danger, a spark dropped into dry cotton. It began with glances, small, stolen, trembling things. She watched him from the veranda during the early mornings, when mist clung to the fields like torn lace. He had a stillness about him, a kind of quiet intelligence that wasn't common among the men forced to work the land. He didn't speak unless spoken to, but when his eyes met hers, something ancient and unspoken passed between them, something that made her chest ache in ways she couldn't name. She tried to ignore it at first. She forced herself to stay inside during field inspections, to occupy her hands with sewing and her mind with scripture, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, the strong lines of his face, the weary calm in his posture, the way he seemed to carry secrets even chains could not silence. She told herself it was pity. She told herself it was curiosity. She never admitted, not even in her private thoughts, that it was hunger. It was during the summer storm of 1839 that the first boundary broke. Lightning had cracked the sky over the plantation, and the overseer had ordered the field workers into the storage barn for shelter. She had gone out to inspect the horses, and there, half-soaked, mud streaking his arms, he was tying down the last of the heavy plows. She shouldn't have been alone with him. Every instinct of her upbringing told her to turn back, to run, to forbid herself this moment. Yet she stepped inside the barn, drawn like a moth to the single candle lit in the darkness. He froze when he saw her, lowering his head out of habit. She asked him why he hadn't sought shelter earlier, and he replied in a voice so soft it startled her. He said he wanted to make sure nothing was destroyed in the storm. It was such a simple answer, but in it she heard loyalty, responsibility, and dignity, the kind no one ever credited enslaved people with. And that was the moment she realized she was lost. The days after that were a war inside her. She battled herself with prayers, with cold baths, with long walks meant to clear her thoughts. But the more she tried to sever the invisible string that tied her to him, the tighter it twisted. He seemed to feel it too. Whenever she passed him in the corridor or across the fields, something in his manner shifted. His shoulders straightened, his breath paused, his eyes flickered with something dangerous and forbidden. And then came the night she could never undo. Her husband was away on business, and the entire house had collapsed into the deep silence of midnight. She couldn't sleep. Her thoughts churned, pulling her from one corner of her mind to the next. Finally, overwhelmed by a force she could no longer restrain, she slipped out of her bedroom and walked barefoot through the corridor, down the stairs, across the veranda and toward the workers' quarters. She didn't know what she was doing. She told herself she only wanted to speak with him, to understand why her soul felt like it was unraveling piece by piece whenever he was near. But when she reached the doorway and he opened the door, eyes widening in shock, chest rising in a sharp breath, her resolve shattered. The two of them stood motionless in the moonlight, the humid night pressing down around them like a suffocating blanket. There were no words. There was no logic. There was only the pull. What happened between them that night was not the kind of tea the world was built to accept. It was not tender or sweet or innocent. It was desperate. Two trapped spirits finding each other in the dark, two people who had no right to want anything, yet wanted everything. When she finally returned to her room before dawn, trembling, breathless, and shaken to her core, she knew her life had split cleanly into two halves, the one she lived before that night, and the one she would live after. But actions, especially forbidden ones, have consequences that spread like fire. She thought their secret would fade after that one night, that shame or fear would push them apart. Instead, the opposite happened. The pull between them deepened, becoming a private world they inhabited in stolen moments, brief meetings in the shadow of the oak trees, whispered conversations near the well, a single touch of hands when no one was looking. She didn't know, not at first, that their connection would echo far beyond herself. She didn't know that while she sought escape in him, something else entirely was unfolding among the enslaved women of the plantation. Something that would change everything, something even she could not stop. And yet, in the beginning, all she understood was the truth she feared most. She loved him. And that love, forbidden by law, morality, and the brutal architecture of the world they lived in, was the first crack in the foundation of everything that would come after. Long before the plantation lady realized what she had stepped into, the enslaved women of Magnolia Hollow had already begun whispering about him. They whispered in the kitchens, in the wash yard, under the trees during the short rest hours, their voices low and trembling like leaves caught in a sick wind. Every plantation had stories, old superstitions carried from one generation to the next, tales shaped by fear and survival. But the stories about him were different. They weren't about ghosts or curses. They were about power, a power he never boasted about, never wielded openly, and yet one that spread through the quarters, like wildfire. It began quietly. A woman named Ruth, strong-backed and sharp-eyed, was the first to speak of it. She told the others he was different, not just in the way he worked or walked, but in the way he listened. Slaves were rarely listened to by anyone, not even by each other sometimes, because survival required silence. But him, he listened like every word mattered. When a woman cried from exhaustion, he helped her finish her tasks before the overseer returned. When someone was punished and left half-broken, he was the one who brought water in the dark and whispered strength back into their bones. Some men gained influence through violence, through rebellion, through loud defiance. But his power was quiet, woven through small acts that didn't look like rebellion but carried the weight of it. The women began trusting him in ways no one understood. Not romantic trust, not the kind that tied itself to longing, but something deeper, safety. And safety, especially in a world built on cruelty, was the rarest treasure a person could offer. The plantation lady had no idea this was happening. She believed her secret encounters with him were hidden in the shadows of her own desire. What she did not know was that the enslaved women already watched him like a man carrying a storm inside him. He never bragged about the nights the plantation lady visited his quarters. He never spoke her name or described her touch. But secrets have a way of leaking through walls, especially in a place where people live 10 steps from each other, and pain sharpens every sense. When the enslaved women realized the mistress had taken an interest in him, their fear turned to something more complicated. Anger, protection, anxiety. They had seen what happened when plantation mistresses wanted something they could not have. Usually someone else paid the price. But what shook them more was what happened afterward. One by one, without explanation, the enslaved women of Magnolia Hollow began falling pregnant. At first, no one questioned it. Plantation life often forced horrors upon women that left them with children they never asked for, but the timing was strange, too close, too sudden. As if a silent wave had rolled through the quarters and touched every woman it passed, Ruth was the first to sense the truth, though she didn't speak it aloud. She noticed the way he avoided their gazes, how he spent long hours in the fields with his jaw clenched, the way he carried a heaviness that wasn't there months before. She had known him the longest. She understood how he changed when burdened by something he couldn't fix. When a woman named Eliza confessed to her that he had comforted her one night after she broke down from a brutal whipping, Ruth knew. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't using them. He wasn't taking advantage of their pain. They were reaching for him. Reaching because he was the only form of warmth left in a world cold enough to shatter them. And he was giving that warmth back, not because he intended to, but because the plantation was a place where choices didn't belong to slaves. Loneliness carved holes in the human spirit. Trauma pulled people together in ways the world above them never understood. And in the suffocating darkness of Magnolia Hollow, one man became the center of a desperate need for comfort. The enslaved women didn't blame him. They blamed the world that shaped him, the structure that crushed everyone beneath it. But they also feared what would happen when the mistress, blind with desire, blind with privilege, discovered she wasn't the only one bound to him. And she did discover it. The turning point came on an afternoon thick with humidity, when the plantation lady overheard 2 house servants whispering behind the pantry door. She heard her own name, she heard his, and then she heard something that snapped the final thread holding her sanity in place. All them women with child, you really think it's coincidence? He the father of every one. The words stuck to her like fresh tar. They didn't slip off, they didn't wash away. And no matter how many times she told herself the servants were gossiping, that they were exaggerating, she could not silence the truth clawing at her mind. The thought tore through her jealousy, her longing, her fragile obsession, because in her eyes, twisted by privilege, shaped by decades of societal poison, he belonged to her, even if their relationship lived only in shadows. For days she watched the women of the quarters with a paranoia that bordered on madness. Their swollen bellies, their quiet smiles between exhaustion, their soft glances toward him, all of it sharpened her rage. She wasn't angry at them. She was angry at him. She believed he had betrayed her, even though she had no right to claim betrayal. She believed he had used her, even though she was the one with the power. What she never understood, what she could never understand, was that he was carrying a guilt that threatened to crush him. He didn't defend himself. He didn't offer explanations. Because explanations didn't exist in a world like theirs. He was a man burdened by the choices he did not fully make, by the needs he tried to comfort, by the scraps of humanity he offered, because no one else offered them. The enslaved women saw all of this and grew protective. They knew the mistress's jealousy could lead to whippings, punishments, sales, broken families. They knew she saw him as hers, not as a person but as an object she claimed in secret. And their fear, their pregnancies, their whispered worries, all spiraled toward the same inevitable truth. His influence over them wasn't born from selfish desire, it was born from survival, from desperation, from the way trauma reshapes human connection. But to the plantation lady, none of that mattered. All she knew was that she loved him, and every other woman's child felt like a knife twisting in the deepest part of her soul. Long before the plantation lady's suspicions ignited like dry straw, the truth had already taken root in the quarters, quietly, like a seed planted in darkness, watered by fear, nurtured by caution, and whispered from woman to woman in the low hum of survival. Even the children sensed it. They watched the adults with wide, knowing eyes, as if they understood the storm gathering long before thunder touched the sky. Magnolia Hollow was a place where secrets never stayed buried. The walls were thin, the rooms crowded, and sorrow had a way of echoing louder than any sermon or whip crack. It began with Eliza, who worked in the wash yard. She was the first to notice patterns no one dared explain aloud. She saw the tiredness in the women's faces, the same kind of tiredness she felt blooming inside her own body. She saw them hold their stomachs at the same time she held hers. She saw their gazes flicker nervously to the same man whenever he walked past, though none of them spoke to him once the overseer's eyes were near. It was a strange, unspoken connection, drawn not from love but from something heavier, darker, and soaked in the bitterness of survival. And Eliza, who had lived long enough on that land to understand the unexplainable, realized the truth long before anyone admitted it. The whispers began at dusk. Women huddled near wash basins or beneath the trees during rare moments of rest. Their voices barely rose above the sound of crickets, yet the fear trembling beneath their words carried more weight than any rumor. They spoke of missed cycles, of dizziness, of cravings. They spoke of the nights when loneliness pushed them into seeking whatever comfort they could find before the darkness swallowed them whole. And they spoke of him, not with judgment or accusation, but with a strange mixture of confusion and sorrow. For he was not like other men. He did not take, he did not demand, he did not force. The plantation twisted men into monsters, but he fought that transformation with quiet defiance. The women knew this. They knew he didn't seek power or influence. He simply existed in the same hell they did, trying to hold on to whatever pieces of humanity the world hadn't ripped away from him. And maybe that was why the whispers were filled more with fear for him than fear of him. They worried what would happen once the mistress discovered the truth. They worried what punishment would fall like a hammer upon his head. They worried what the master would do once his pride was bruised and his masculinity wounded. They worried because they knew this was a world where consequences were always cruel, always violent, and always unfair. And they worried because the man at the center of it all, the man who had unknowingly become the beating heart of the quarters, carried the calmness of someone resigned to suffer for sins he didn't commit. The whispers traveled farther than expected. They slithered from mouth to mouth, from the women in the fields to the men who avoided speaking about it, to the older slaves who prayed the situation wouldn't explode into catastrophe. Even the midwife knew. She didn't speak often, but her eyes told stories her lips never dared. She had delivered too many babies to ignore the shared timing of the pregnancies swelling across the quarters. And though she tried to remain neutral, she was human. She cared, and caring made everything heavier. The plantation lady, wrapped in her illusions of secrecy, walked through her routines unaware that the entire quarters already knew what she had tried so desperately to hide. They had seen her slip out of bed at night. They had heard the creak of the boards whenever she tiptoed across the floors. They knew when she disappeared. They knew who she visited. And they knew what it meant, not just for her, but for all of them. Shh! E-quarters whispered of her obsession. They whispered of the danger it carried. They whispered about jealousy, about punishment, about the wrath of a mistress who could destroy lives with a single command. Their fear wasn't unfounded. Many had seen women whipped, sold, or starved for far less. Their only hope was that she would never discover the full truth, that the children forming inside their bodies all carried the blood of the same man. Because once she realized it, nothing would remain the same. The man himself knew about the whispers. He heard them when he walked past the quarters at night. He heard his name spoken in fear, in sorrow, in apology. He never defended himself. He never explained. What explanation could he offer? That he had tried to give warmth in a world of coldness, that he had tried to be human in a place that punished humanity, that the women who sought him out were not driven by lust but by survival, trauma, and a desperate desire to feel alive for a moment in a life shaped by cruelty? No explanation existed that would make sense to a mistress blinded by desire and privilege. So he carried the whispers like weights around his ankles. He worked harder to avoid suspicion. He kept his eyes down. He kept his voice quiet. He tried to shrink himself, hoping that shrinking would somehow make everything less dangerous. But shrinking doesn't erase truth, and whispers don't disappear just because a man wishes them to. The children in the quarters heard the murmurs too. They watched with wide eyes as the adults moved in anxiety. They saw their mothers hold secret meetings. They saw their fathers look away with expressions carved from shame and helplessness. Even they understood that something was forming in the shadows, something bigger than gossip, bigger than scandal, bigger than the plantation lady herself. And eventually the whispers reached the place where all dangerous truths eventually ended, the ears of someone willing to twist them into poison. It was a house servant, hidden behind the pantry door, eavesdropping not out of malice but out of curiosity. She heard two women discussing the pregnancies, discussing the man at the center of them, discussing the mistress's involvement. She didn't want trouble, but trouble followed gossip like a shadow follows the sun. And once the rumor slipped from her lips and into the ears of another servant, closer to the mistress, more loyal, more foolish, it was only a matter of time before it reached the one person it should never have reached. The quarters knew the storm was coming long before the first drop of rain fell. They knew the moment the mistress heard the whispers, Magnolia Hollow would ignite into chaos. But there was nothing they could do to stop it. All they could do was watch as whispers, once only meant to protect, became the knife that tore the plantation in two. The first sign was so small, so ordinary, that the plantation lady barely noticed it at all. A dropped bucket, a fainting spell in the morning heat, a woman sitting down more often than usual while shelling peas. These were normal things in a place where exhaustion lived in every bone. But Magnolia Hollow had a way of revealing truth slowly, like peeling back layers of mold from a forgotten wall. Nothing stayed hidden forever, not even the things people desperately tried to bury. It was Sarah, the housemaid, who unknowingly planted the first seed of suspicion. She was folding linens one morning when she paused, pressed a hand against her lower back, and winced. The plantation lady noticed from across the room. Sarah murmured that she was just tired, but there was something in the way her body moved, something soft, cautious, fragile, that made the mistress's eyes narrow. She had seen that kind of movement before. She had made that movement before, years ago when she lost her own child before it could take its first breath. But she pushed the thought aside. One pregnant woman meant nothing. Life on plantations was brutal and unpredictable. Children came and went like seasons, and sorrow was baked into the land. It was the second woman who unsettled her. On the third day, while walking past the laundry line, she caught sight of Eliza pressing a trembling hand to her stomach. The gesture was gentle, almost protective. Too protective. And when Eliza saw her mistress watching, she dropped her hand as if burned. The fear in her eyes cut through the lady's thoughts like an unexpected blade. Why fear? Why hide? Why act as though guilt was blossoming beneath the skin? That night she lay awake staring at the ceiling, unable to silence the echo of her own heartbeat. Her secret, her nights in the shadows, her whispered pleasure, her shame molded into desire, had been safe for months. Safe because she believed she alone knew where her feet carried her after midnight. Safe because she thought he would never breathe a word. Safe because she wanted to believe it. But seeing that fear in Eliza's eyes planted a different kind of terror inside her. The fear that she had never been as evil as she imagined. The next day, she took a slower walk through the quarters, pretending to check on chores. She moved carefully, pretending she wasn't studying every woman's body, every step, every expression, and suddenly, she saw patterns everywhere. Ruth walked with her shoulders drawn tight, as if guarding something fragile. Miriam moved with a new heaviness, the kind that comes from nausea that never fully leaves. Even the younger girls whispered in corners, glancing nervously toward the fields where he worked. It was as if the entire quarters were holding their breath. The plantation lady felt something cold and sharp slide down her spine. She didn't want to jump to conclusions. She didn't want to think what she was thinking. But the truth, however faint, however impossible, was already pounding against her ribs. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't chance. It wasn't normal. Too many women, too close in age, too synchronized in their symptoms. She told herself there had to be another explanation. Plantation life was a cruel equation. Overseers, traders, visiting men, any one of them could have caused this. But that reassurance didn't soothe her, because those men didn't look at the women the way she had seen them looking at him. They didn't speak to them in soft tones. They didn't linger near them at dusk. They didn't carry quiet grief in their eyes. Only he did. She remembered the way he looked at her the night she first took him. There had been no anger, no hatred, just a dull, resigned sorrow that made her chest tighten in a way she didn't understand. She mistook it for shyness then. She mistook it for innocence. But now she wondered if she had misread everything. What if he had been carrying secrets even then? What if she hadn't been the only one seeking warmth in the dark? Jealousy crept into her chest like poison ivy, growing silently, wrapping itself around her ribs until breathing became difficult. She hated the feeling, hated how it swallowed her dignity, hated how it made her feel weak. She was the mistress, she was the one with power, she was the one he should have wanted, even if obligation, not desire, drove him to her bed. She refused to believe he might have shared himself elsewhere. She refused to imagine him touching the others the way he touched her. But the signs were everywhere, belly after belly, pale faces, nausea, quiet, fearful glances between the women, and worst of all, the way they avoided looking at him when she was near. Guilt flickered through their eyes, but guilt mixed with something deeper, protection, as if they knew the danger that would fall upon him once she discovered the truth. That look told her more than any confession could. Inside her something broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but softly, like old glass cracking under pressure. She returned to the house, her steps slow and unsteady. She sat at her vanity, staring into the mirror. Her reflection looked older, colder, sharper. The corners of her mouth trembled. Her hands shook as she clasped them together. She felt betrayed, humiliated, and terrified all at once. He had touched her, held her, whispered into her ear in the dark, and now she realized she might have been nothing more than one of many. It shattered her pride. It tore at her heart. It awakened something dark inside her, because the plantation lady was not a woman accustomed to sharing. She was not a woman who accepted disloyalty, even imagined disloyalty, and she was not a woman who forgave quietly. From that moment she watched the women with the sharpness of a hawk eyeing its prey. She counted every swell beneath their dresses. She marked every pale morning. She tracked their steps, their chores, their glances, and the more she saw, the more convinced she became. These pregnancies were not coincidence. They were connected, and the connection led directly to him. Her desire turned to suspicion, her suspicion turned to obsession, and her obsession was about to rip Magnolia Hollow apart. Fear is a strange thing. It crawls into a person slowly, first as a whisper, then as a shadow, then as a hunger that eats from the inside until nothing feels real anymore. That was how it began for the plantation lady. She was not a weak woman. She was not easily shaken. She had grown up in a world where cruelty was normal and silence was survival. Yet the idea forming in her mind, the possibility that the women of Magnolia Hollow were carrying the children of the same man she had taken into her own bed, unraveled her composure like a loose thread pulled too hard. Her fear did not stay fear for long. It morphed, twisted, transformed itself into a new emotion. Something sharper, something darker, something far more dangerous. Curiosity, the kind that consumes rational thought, the kind that drives a woman to peel open secrets even when she knows the truth might burn her alive, the kind that ruins everything. She began observing them more closely, not openly, but with the silent precision of someone who had something to lose. Her eyes followed the women, like a second shadow. She watched their bodies, their rhythms, the way their hands drifted protectively over their stomachs. She watched the way they looked at him, and the way they didn't. She watched the way they avoided being near him when she was around, how they stiffened, how their eyes darted like frightened birds. It was fear, not guilt, not shame. Fear of what she might do, fear of who she might become, and fear was fuel. In the quiet hours of the night, she found herself replaying every moment she had spent with him, every whispered breath, every trembling touch. Every time he looked at her with eyes that never quite revealed what he felt, she searched those memories for clues, any sign that he might have been hiding another life beneath the one she shared with him. But she found nothing. Nothing except the possibility that she had never understood him at all. Curiosity became sleeplessness. Sleeplessness became obsession, and obsession steered her toward a truth she wasn't prepared to face. One evening, when the sun was bleeding its last light across the fields, she stood on the upstairs balcony, looking down at the quarters. Smoke rose from the chimneys, lanterns flickered in windows. The women moved about slowly, quietly, carrying out their end-of-day routines, but something in their movements felt synchronized, united by an unspoken pact. It was as if every woman carried a secret beneath her ribs, and they were all guarding it with identical care. That was when the mistress noticed something she had overlooked, something that made her breath falter. The timing, the identical timing. Not one woman looked more than a month ahead of another. Not one bee. Lee seemed more advanced. Their nausea, their fatigue, their hesitations, all were unfolding at the same pace, a coincidence too perfect to dismiss, too deliberate to ignore. The realization hit her with the force of a blow. If they were all carrying children conceived at nearly the same time, if every woman shared the same hidden story beneath their skin, then there was only one explanation. He hadn't simply touched them, he had touched them around the same time he touched her, and that enraged her more than anything else. Not because he had other lovers. She could never call them lovers, not in a place built on chains and suffering, but because the timing placed them all on equal ground. She had no claim. She had no special place. She was not the exception she convinced herself she was. Her fear retreated into a corner of her chest. Her pride rose to replace it. She began walking the plantation more than usual. She lingered in doorways. She eavesdropped near the kitchens. She pretended to check the crops but used the opportunity to watch him from a distance. He was strong, steady, relentless in his labor. Sweat glistened across his back. Muscles moved beneath skin shaped by years of brutality. To her, he was beauty sculpted from hardship, but now, that beauty felt like a deception she had willingly fallen into. What she couldn't understand, what she refused to understand, was that he served the same world she ruled over. His choices were not luxuries. His desires were not freedoms. His actions were shaped by the cruel mechanics of survival. But she saw none of that. She saw only betrayal where there was none to begin with. One afternoon she tested her theory. She called for Eliza to bring water to the porch. Eliza arrived trembling, her hands shaking so hard the water sloshed over the rim. The mistress took the cup and said nothing. She simply held Eliza's gaze, a gaze filled with terror so pure it confirmed every suspicion. The women weren't afraid of their pregnancies, they were afraid of her reaction to them. And that made her curiosity flare like wildfire. She wanted to know everything. Who had been the first? Where it happened? Who else was involved? What he said? How he touched them? Whether he whispered to them the same words he whispered to her? Whether they sought him out, or whether he sought them? A sickness bloomed inside her, not physical but emotional, a craving for truth that felt almost feverish. She followed the women around like a ghost. She lingered behind corners. She overheard half-finished conversations. She watched hands trembling over swollen stomachs. She tracked every glance toward him, every shift in posture, every moment of silence. Her curiosity crossed boundaries even her privileged upbringing had once considered immoral. She began entering the quarters unannounced. She rummaged through possessions she had no right to touch. She questioned the women in ways that made them avert their eyes and bite their lips until they bled. But none of them broke. None of them spoke. None of them revealed anything. And their silence confirmed the truth more than words ever could. Finally, her curiosity pushed her toward the one person she had avoided confronting. Him. She approached him in the fields, her footsteps a storm building behind her. He paused his work, sweat dripping down his face, chest rising, and falling with the slow, weary rhythm of someone who had worked himself numb. When he lifted his eyes to hers, she felt a wave crash inside her, a flood of desire, betrayal, fear, longing, and anger all at once. She wanted to ask him everything. She wanted to demand answers. She wanted him to deny it, to confess, to weep, to rage, anything that gave her something to hold on to. But he looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, not sorrow, not fear, not longing, just acceptance, as if he already knew the truth had reached her heart, as if he knew she had discovered what the women had tried so desperately to hide, as if he knew her curiosity would soon turn into something far more catastrophic. And in that moment, the plantation lady realized something horrifying. Her curiosity wasn't seeking truth anymore. It was seeking justification for whatever she was about to do next. By the time Eleanor Hayes began noticing the patterns, the plantation had already shifted around her like a silent, breathing creature. At first, she blamed her own exhaustion. Nights spent pacing the veranda, listening to the relentless hum of summer insects, made her vulnerable to paranoia. Yet the more she observed, the more she realized her plantation was no longer responding to her. It was responding to him, the man she thought she had possessed, the slave she believed was hers alone. His presence, once confined to the shadows of the quarters, had seeped into every corner of Hayes Manor. She noticed it not through bold rebellion, but through subtleties, an exchange of glances between the women, shifts in behavior among the men, and the eerie way conversations stop. Ped, when she walked by. It was almost as if they had formed a web she was never meant to see, but one she could feel tightening around her. The first undeniable sign was the ledger. Eleanor had kept meticulous records since the day she inherited the estate. Sugar, cotton, livestock, inventory, nothing escaped her ink. But recently she discovered pages rearranged, numbers altered, and notes she knew she had never written. More disturbing were the new entries written in small, neat handwriting. They were not addressed to her. They were instructions left for someone else. Tasks, schedules, movements, a system working independently of her authority, and at the center of all of it was his name. At first, she thought one of the overseers had taken liberties with plantation operations. But when she confronted them, she found confusion, fear even. One by one, they avoided her eyes, their voices shaking as if they were terrified of speaking the wrong name out loud. It wasn't defiance, it was submission. But not to her. She realized then that the slave she shared a bed with, the one she believed she had chosen, the one she thought she controlled, had built something sprawling and invisible under her roof. Eleanor decided to watch the plantation from afar. She stopped interfering in daily routines and observed silently from her second-floor window. What she saw made her chest tighten. The women moved around him like a tide drawn to the moon. Not seduced, aligned, as if every decision they made revolved around him. Children who barely reached his knees ran to him before their own mothers. The men, normally competitive and territorial, stepped aside for him in a way that was almost ceremonial. It was not dominance through violence. It was something older, deeper, and infinitely more dangerous. She realized with rising dread that he had become the silent axis on which the plantation turned. He never raised his voice. He never exerted physical force. But his influence was undeniable. People trusted him in ways they had never trusted their owners. People confided in him, even when silence was safer. People sought his approval, even when it cost them sleep. Eleanor watched the transformation unfold, like an infection spreading through her land. Once, the plantation had responded to the sound of her footsteps. Now, it responded to the shift of his weight. But how had this started? How had he built such an intricate network of loyalty in a place where even survival was uncertain? The answer revealed itself in fragments, small but unmistakably intentional. First, it was the stolen minutes she found missing from her schedule. Times when he disappeared, without permission, and returned with a calmness that infuriated her, simply because she could not shake it loose from him. Then it was the messages she found tucked in cracks between floorboards or under tools in the barn, coded short, but clearly part of something organized. And then there were the rumors, relayed to her by trembling maids, whispered behind locked doors, surrounded by the thick air of superstition. Tales of the way he listened, the way he remembered, the way he offered comfort not with words but with presence. a presence magnetic enough to draw in those who were lonely, broken, or forgotten. He became the one everyone turned to, the one everyone trusted with secrets they would never dare share with her. The women were the first to fall into his orbit, but the men were not far behind. He offered them something Eleanor had never thought mattered to them: respect. Quiet, steady, dangerous respect. It made him irresistible, not romantically, but spiritually. A leader they had not chosen but had recognized. As weeks passed, Eleanor realized this was more than loyalty, it was allegiance. She began noticing small signals exchanged among the workers, touches to the wrist, subtle nods, taps on the windowsills. A whole language had developed under her nose, a communication system used only when he was nearby, like ripples responding to the movement of a stone cast into a still pond. She confronted him one night, the fury inside her boiling over into her voice, but he only looked at her, calm, unreadable, almost sympathetic. It was the first time she realized she was not speaking to someone beneath her. She was speaking to someone who no longer saw her as an authority. When she demanded answers, he did not respond with fear. He responded with silence, a silence that said more than any confession. It was then she understood the truth she had been refusing to acknowledge. This man had outgrown the role she gave him. He had evolved into something she did not have a name for, something that frightened her in ways she could not articulate. He had built a network not of rebellion, not of violence, but of loyalty. A loyalty stronger than chains, stronger than ownership. A loyalty she could never hope to match. And for the first time since inheriting Hayes Manor, Eleanor Hayes felt the ground beneath her shift, not from external threat, but from the realization that the kingdom she ruled was no longer hers. It belonged to him. Long before Eleanor Hayes admitted it aloud, she sensed that the reach of the man she once believed she controlled had stretched far beyond the borders of her estate. It began with small, almost trivial hints, rumors whispered by traders passing through, strange looks given by neighbors, and a tension in the air whenever his name was spoken. But the true weight of it settled on her slowly, the way cold seeps into a room at night, unnoticed at first, then unavoidable. What disturbed her most was how naturally he had extended himself into spaces she thought were insulated from the chaos of plantation life. Hayes Manor stood on hundreds of acres, surrounded by other estates that maintained a delicate, unspoken balance with one another. Information moved like smoke, thin, shapeless, and impossible to catch. Yet somehow he had entered that network without her permission, without her awareness, and without ever leaving her land. The first warning came on a humid afternoon when Eleanor hosted a gathering of local plantation wives. They were proper women, powdered and polished, dressed in fabrics too heavy for the southern heat. They came to gossip, to display their wealth, to judge and be judged. These gatherings were Eleanor's arena, a place where she could still claim authority uncontested. But that day, she lost control before she even knew it. One of the ladies mentioned a delivery delay from a neighboring estate. Another casually added that their workers refused to follow orders during the last harvest. A third claimed that her husband had dismissed an overseer for failing to keep certain men in line. Their woe. RDS should have been simple plantation complaints, the kind Eleanor had heard her entire life. But something in the way they spoke, restrained, uneasy, almost fearful, tightened her stomach. Then one of them said it. "There's a man out there. One the slaves speak about too freely. They say he listens more than he talks. They say he understands things." Eleanor felt her breath falter. Another lady leaned closer. "Some are calling him a healer. Others say he's a prophet." The laughter that followed was hollow, forced. They had no idea who they were describing, but Eleanor did. Her heartbeat hammered against her ribs in a slow, heavy rhythm. She managed to keep her expression calm, but inside something cracked. How could they know? How had his name traveled beyond her land? She asked questions cautiously, pretending casual curiosity, but every rumor tied back to small, unsettling details. A worker on a nearby estate who suddenly recovered from a fever after speaking to him. A woman who claimed he comforted her during childbirth when no one else was there. A man who whispered that the one with the calm eyes predicted the rain before it came. None of these stories should have been possible. He had not left her plantation. She would have known. She watched him too closely. Didn't she? But the more she listened, the more impossible truths piled up. and the ladies noticed her silence. One of them, a sharp-tongued widow known for cruelty masked as charm, narrowed her eyes and asked, "Tell me, Eleanor, have you heard these tales on your land as well?" Eleanor forced a smile, but her throat tightened. "Stories travel. You know how workers embellish things." They nodded, relieved to shift blame onto superstition. But Eleanor was not relieved. She excused herself as soon as she could, retreating to the solitude of her room. There, behind a locked door, she allowed her mask to slip. Breathing unsteady, she paced the floor, replaying every rumor and every detail. He was influencing people she had never met. He had become a figure not just inside her home, but across the countryside. And he had done it quietly, invisibly, without ever raising a hand. How? There were moments, brief, disorienting moments, when she had wondered if he carried something unnatural in him, a presence, a stillness, a watchful intelligence that unnerved even her. His silence, once comforting, now felt loaded with intention. His calmness, once intimate, now seemed strategic. She remembered the first night she had brought him into her room, how he never flinched, never hesitated, never even appeared surprised. Most men trembled in her presence. But he had looked at her with an expression she could never decipher. Respect? Pity? Or something colder, like assessment? Now she wondered if he had known even then how far his reach would stretch. The next confirmation came from a source Eleanor trusted even less than the plantation wives, the overseers. Rough men hardened by heat and cruelty, they seldom cared about anything beyond their duties. But one morning, an overseer approached her with a report she couldn't ignore. "Ma'am," he said, voice wavering, "3 workers from the Wilkes estate came by last night. They said they walked here just to see him." Eleanor froze. "See who?" The overseer swallowed hard. "That man of yours." Her hand tightened around the chair beside her. "Why?" "They said he helps people, talks to 'em, gives advice. They said he's the only one who listens." His words burned through her like acid. "Send them away," she ordered sharply. "Tell them they're trespassing." "We did," the overseer said, "but they said they'll be back, and they weren't scared, ma'am. Not of me, not of anyone." That shook her. Fear was the currency overseers depended on. If fear didn't work, power shifted. Later that night, unable to sleep, Eleanor walked through the plantation grounds. The air was thick and heavy with the scent of tobacco in summer. She moved quietly, searching for signs of the influence she could no longer deny. What she found made her heart stop. At the edge of the quarters, men and women from another estate stood in a quiet circle. They were waiting. And when he stepped out of the shadows, they gravitated toward him, drawn by something she could not compete with. He did not command them. He did not preach. He simply listened. And as he listened, Eleanor realized she was watching not a rebellion, but something much more terrifying. A man becoming a symbol whose reach now extended far beyond her walls, a symbol she could no longer contain. He belonged to no one, not even her. Fear is a strange thing. It rarely announces itself honestly. It creeps in through the smallest cracks, disguised as doubt, disguised as unease, disguised as a question whispered too late to take back. And for Eleanor Hayes, fear began the first time she realized she could not predict him, not his thoughts, not his intentions, not even the shadows behind his eyes. She had convinced herself for months that she understood him. She believed that because she had chosen him, desired him, and protected him, she owned some part of his mind. She believed she could read him the way she read the weather, the seasons, the shifting moods of her estate. But now, standing on the upper balcony overlooking the workers' quarters, watching him interact with people she had forbidden to enter her land, she felt a cold truth settle into her bones. She knew nothing. His movements were slow and deliberate, but there was a confidence in him that she had seen only in free men, men who walked with a purpose, men who expected to be heard. He listened to those who came to him with the patience of someone who was not afraid of being interrupted. He spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had already decided the shape of his own destiny. That was what terrified her most. He carried himself like a man with secrets, secrets older, deeper, and more dangerous than anything she had allowed herself to imagine. As she watched from above, one of the visiting workers, a young man no older than 20, began speaking frantically. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the desperation in his posture. Then she saw something far more unsettling, the way the others looked at him. They were not looking at him with fear or suspicion. They were looking at him with trust. Trust was power, and she had none of it. When he finally stepped away from the group and began walking toward the small path leading into the woods behind the estate, something inside Eleanor snapped. She left the balcony, descended the stairs, and followed him, quietly at first, keeping her distance. She didn't know what she intended to say, she only knew she needed answers. The woods at night were suffocatingly still, branches arched overhead like the ribs of a cathedral, and the moonlight bled through in thin ribbons. She moved through the underbrush, her breath unsteady, until she found him standing beside the creek, staring at the water as if it held some message meant only for him. He didn't turn. When she approached, he didn't startle. He simply said, "You shouldn't be out here." His voice was low, steady, calm, too calm. Eleanor swallowed hard. "Why are they coming to you? Why are they speaking to you as if you belong to them?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched near the water, dipped his fingers into the cold stream, and watched the ripples spread outward. Only when the last ripple had vanished did he stand and face her. "When people have no one to listen," he said softly, "they look for someone who can." That answer cut through her like a blade. "You're not a leader," she snapped. "You're—" He lifted his gaze to hers and the words died in her throat. There was something in his eyes she had never seen before. Not defiance, not anger. Something far more terrifying. Detachment. As if he had long ago accepted a truth she was only now beginning to comprehend. "You think you know me," he said quietly. "Because you wanted to—" Her breath caught. "You saw something in me, something you thought you could claim, something you thought belonged to you." She stepped backward, pulse hammering. "I saved you, I protected you, You chose me for your reasons," he interrupted, voice steady. "Not mine." His calmness rattled her. She had never heard him challenge her so openly. She felt as if the ground beneath her feet were shifting, pulling away from everything she thought was hers. "You're turning them against me," she whispered. He shook his head. "They were against the world long before I spoke to them." "Why do they trust you?" she demanded. "What have you told them? What are you planning?" A faint, unreadable expression flickered across his face. "I don't plan anything. I simply listen. And when people are heard, they see paths they didn't see before." That was when Eleanor felt the full weight of fear press into her chest. It wasn't that he was plotting against her. It wasn't that he was forming alliances or organizing rebellion. It was that he didn't need to. His influence wasn't built on force. It wasn't built on threats. It wasn't even built on intention. It was rooted in something far more dangerous. People believed in him, not because he asked them to, not because he promised them anything, but because his presence alone was enough to reshape the thoughts of those who came near him. He had become a mirror, reflecting back to others the things they feared, the things they wanted, the things they dared not speak, and in their reflections, they found courage. She saw it clearly now. She saw the truth she had been afraid to name. He was never hers. He had never been anyone's. There was something in him, something unbreakable, something untamed, something that answered to no one. She had mistaken his silence for submission. She had mistaken his gentleness for dependence. But beneath all of it was a mind sharper, deeper, and more enigmatic than she had ever realized. And as she stood in the moonlit woods, feeling her world tilt into something unrecognizable, she understood the most terrifying truth of all. She wasn't afraid because she had lost control of him. She was afraid because she never had control to begin with. Fear spreads faster than fire on a hot Tennessee night. All it needs is one trembling voice, one uncertain whisper, and suddenly the whole world tilts into superstition. Tea was what began happening on Hayes Plantation. It didn't start with Eleanor, nor with any overseer. It started with the workers themselves, the men and women who lived in the shadows, who noticed every shift in the atmosphere, who sensed danger before the masters ever smelled smoke. They were the first to murmur it. Something was different about him. They didn't say it loudly. They didn't speak it in sentences. It began as a hush, half-syllables carried by the wind, traded at the well, breathed at dusk. They said he never tired, even when the fields drained the strength of every other worker. They said his eyes saw deeper than a man's should, as if he could look into people rather than at them. Some said he walked through the fields late at night when everyone else was asleep, speaking to no one, listening to something only he could hear. Eleanor began noticing the way people watched him, not with resentment or jealousy, but with the same uneasy reverence villagers reserve for wandering prophets or strange hermits in mountains. It made her throat tighten. She wanted to ignore it, pretend it was nothing. But rumors are stubborn things. Once born, they grow legs. One night, Eleanor overheard two elderly women whispering outside the kitchen. Their backs were bent, their hands knotted with years of labor, but their voices trembled like frightened children. "He ain't right," one woman murmured. "Ain't no man speaks like that. He tells you things about yourself you ain't never said aloud." The other nodded slowly. "My grandson said he knew the rain was coming. Knew it before the sky even turned." Eleanor stepped into the hallway so suddenly that the women scattered like birds chased from a field. But their fear lingered in the air like a stain she could not wash away. Even the overseers, hard men who believed in nothing but violence, began avoiding him. It wasn't intentional at first. It was instinctive. When he walked past them, shoulders relaxed, eyes calm, they stepped aside. Not because he was dangerous in any physical sense, but because danger lives in the unseen, and something in him rattled old, buried instincts. Soon the whispers gained shape. Some called him blessed, others called him cursed, but more and more began calling him something else, something that made Eleanor's blood run cold every time she heard it. Not human. They didn't mean creature or beast. They meant something higher, or lower, than mankind. Something ancient, something born with a purpose, something neither chains nor commands could bind. Eleanor tried to silence the rumors. She forbade talk of superstition. She threatened punishments for anyone spreading such nonsense. But the more she tried to contain the narrative, the more it slipped through her fingers. Rumors thrive where fear lives, and fear had already woven itself through the plantation like roots under soil. Late one night, after hours of restless pacing, Eleanor woke abruptly to a knock at her door. It was one of the younger women from the quarters. She stood trembling, clutching her hands to her chest. "Ma'am, please, you must come." "Why?" Eleanor demanded, annoyed and half panicked. "It's him." Those two words pulled Eleanor from her room faster than flame chasing dry timber. She followed the girl across the silent grounds. The moon hung low, white and swollen, casting a cold glow across the fields. When they reached the tree line, Eleanor saw a group of workers standing in a circle, heads bowed, murmuring. At first she thought someone had died. Then she saw him. He stood in the center of the circle, back straight, expression unreadable. The people around him were crying, not out of pain but relief. One woman sobbed into her hands as he placed a steady palm on her back, whispering something Eleanor couldn't hear. "What is happening here?" she demanded, her voice cracking through the night. The circle parted instantly. Fear, guilt, awe, every emotion flashed across the workers' faces. But he didn't flinch. He simply turned and looked at her. There was no shame in his eyes, no apology, no attempt to hide what she had witnessed, only a calm acceptance as if he expected her arrival. "What are you doing?" she asked, voice tight. For a moment, he didn't answer. Instead, he stepped toward her, the energy around him shifting, subtle, powerful, impossible to describe. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, gentle, but carried weight that made her chest contract. "They needed comfort," he said. Nothing more. But Eleanor didn't believe that. Not anymore. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You're scaring them." "They were already scared," he replied. "Long before they came to me." "What are you?" she whispered. For the first time, something flickered behind his eyes. He didn't answer. He didn't smile. He didn't deny it. He simply tilted his head slightly, as if the question itself were misguided. Eleanor took a step back, her breath catching. If he had laughed, she could have dismissed it. If he had reassured her, she might have calmed. If he had denied it, she might have rebuilt her illusions. But his silence was worse than any confession. The workers behind him bowed their heads, some in fear, some in reverence. One of them, an older man who rarely spoke, whispered hoarsely, "Ma'am." "He ain't like the rest of us. He sees things." Eleanor felt her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She turned sharply and walked away, refusing to let them see her tremble. But the darkness was unforgiving. It walked with her, pressed into her skin. She could feel the truth pulsing behind every rumor, every whisper, every terrified glance. He was no longer just a man she had brought into her home. He had become something else, something that defied logic, that defied ownership, that defied her understanding of the world, and the plantation was no longer whispering it out of fear. They were whispering it because they believed it. There comes a moment in every ruin where the person watching finally realizes the collapse did not happen suddenly. It was not lightning, it was not a single blow, it was slow decay, rot forming in the beams long before the roof fell. Eleanor Hayes reached that moment on a night when everything felt too still, too quiet, too aware, a night when she finally understood that the chaos consuming her plantation was not attacking her. It was answering to him. The realization did not come in a scream or a shattering moment. It came as an unwelcome whisper in her own mind, something she had avoided for months. It began as she walked through the empty hallway of her mansion, candle trembling in her hand. The walls, once symbols of her control, now felt like they were leaning inward, listening, judging. Every footstep echoed back at her as if the house itself no longer recognized her authority. She could no longer escape one truth. She had brought him into her life by choice, and every consequence was hers to bear. When she reached the doorway of her study, she froze. The room smelled of tobacco and old paper, but there was something else, something faint, like the ghost of a presence. She knew he had been in this room earlier, talking to one of the workers Eleanor had reluctantly allowed inside. She had overheard the conversation from a distance. It wasn't the words that disturbed her, it was the calmness in his tone, the way he spoke to people, not beneath him, not above him, but as though he were separate from all of them. And he had learned that way of speaking inside her home. Now she stood alone in the study, touching the chair where he had sat. Her fingers trembled. The leather was still warm. She closed her eyes, remembering a time when the idea of him sitting in her study would have been unthinkable, when he was nothing more than a choice she made out of desire, curiosity, and arrogance. But she had underestimated him. She thought his silence meant obedience. She thought his gentleness meant dependence. She thought choosing him made her powerful. Instead, bringing him into her world had dismantled every illusion she relied on to keep her life stable. A soft knock echoed from the hallway. It was Samuel, the oldest worker on the plantation. He rarely dared to speak to the mistress directly. But now he stepped forward, hat in hand, face pale. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "there's something you need to know." Eleanor didn't want to hear it. She already felt the truth clawing at her, but she nodded stiffly. Samuel took a breath. "It's about him. You let him close to you, too close." The words struck her harder than she expected. Samuel continued, his voice cracking. "Whatever he is, whoever he is, he ain't meant to belong to nobody. Not you, not us, not this place." Eleanor steadied herself on the edge of the desk. It was one thing to suspect this in the privacy of her own mind. It was another to hear it from someone else. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. Samuel lifted his eyes, tired, wise, frightened. "Because you're the one who opened the door. You're the one he followed. You're the reason he's here. Whatever's happening, it started with you." Her breath stilled in her throat. When Samuel left, Eleanor sank into the chair he had warmed hours earlier. She pressed her palms to her face, trembling as the truth she had buried finally rose to the surface. She had let him into her life out of hunger, for beauty, for escape, for the illusion of control. She told herself she was choosing him. But every choice had been guided by something she didn't understand, something inside him that drew people, changed people, unsettled people. She had let that into her home, into her bed, into her mind, and now she couldn't remove it. The consequences grew around her like vines. Workers flocked to him. Overseers stepped out of his path. Rumors spread like infection. Even the neighboring estates whispered his name cautiously, as though it carried weight. The world around her had shifted, and she couldn't find her footing. Later that night she went outside, seeking air that didn't feel suffocating. The sky was starless, a heavy black canopy pressing down on the land. She walked past the veranda, across the dirt path, toward the place she knew she'd find him. And he was there, leaning against the fence, looking out into the fields as though searching for something beyond the horizon. She hesitated, but the need for answers pushed her forward. "You've changed everything," she said quietly. He did not turn to look at her. "I haven't changed anything." "You have," she insisted. "The workers listen to you, the overseers avoid you, people from other estates seek you out. Even I." Her voice broke. She hated that he heard it. "Even you what?" he asked. She swallowed hard. Even I can't explain you anymore." He finally turned, his expression unreadable but not cruel. "I never asked for anyone's belief." "That's not the point," she whispered. "Belief came anyway. Influence came anyway. This plantation is not the same place it was before you arrived." He stepped closer, and the night around them seemed to shift with him. "You let me into your world," he said softly. "But you never asked what part of it would change once I walked inside." Her chest tightened painfully. "What are you?" she whispered. He looked at her with a strange sadness, as though the question itself was a burden. "I am what people need me to be," he said. She took a step back, shaken. "You brought me here," he continued, "and because of that, everything that grows from this belongs to you too." She felt the weight of his words crash over her like cold water. He wasn't blaming her. He wasn't threatening her. He was stating a fact she could not run from. The consequences were hers, all of them. She wasn't losing control because of him. She had lost control the moment she chose him, the moment she let him into the deepest parts of her life, believing she could shape him, contain him, define him. But he was never meant to be defined. He stepped past her, walking into the darkness with the quiet certainty of a man who did not fear the unknown. Eleanor remained standing alone under the night sky, understanding the truth fully at last. The world she had known was gone. The rules she depended on no longer applied, and the man she brought into her life, the man she believed she owned, had become the force that unraveled the entire structure she built her identity on. Her downfall did not come from an enemy. It came from the door she opened herself, and now nothing she did could close it.